Welcome. It is my great pleasure to start off yet another of our seminar series, the Rethinking European Development and Security Speaker Series. Today, we have a fantastic speaker. Eugene Finkel is the Kenneth Keller Associate Professor of International Affairs at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's one of the foremost social scientists working on Russia and Eastern Europe, both its tragic history and its currently troubled present. He's a scholar of the Holocaust, of violence and resistance, and the author of several prize-winning books, starting with Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust, then Reform and Rebellion in Weak States, Bread and Autocracy, Food Politics and Security in Putin's Russia, and most recently, and the book that he'll speak on today, is Intent to Destroy, Russia's 200-year quest to dominate Ukraine. So please join me in welcoming Eugene Finkel.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Anna, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. Now, my talk today, as Anna said, based on my forthcoming book, Intent to Destroy. It's out in November this year with Basic Books. This is the first time I'm presenting this book, so I apologize if it's a bit rough. And if you like the talk, then please buy the book. You will find much more stuff there. If you don't like the talk, still, please do buy the book. You will have even more stuff to hate. Now, the book is not an academic manuscript. It's more aimed at the general public. And the working title that I chose as I work on this book was To Kill Ukraine. That's also the title of this talk. And that's exactly what I try to explain in my book. Unfortunately, the editor didn't like the title. He thought it sounds more like a to-do manual, which I'm definitely not doing. But the book started as an attempt to understand Russian violence against civilians in Ukraine during this war since February 2022. And if you follow the news about the war, then you definitely know that violence against civilians is a key feature of this war. Mass executions in places like Bucha, destruction of Mariupol, rape, sexual violence, and even some more gruesome cases such as beheadings, impaling heads on sticks, castrating POWs with box cutters, etc., etc. And this is a bit of a puzzle, to put it mildly, if you follow Russian propaganda, especially during the first stages of the war, when they presented this war as a war of liberation. Russia, at least according to the official story, went to Ukraine to liberate the Russian speakers who are being oppressed and mistreated by the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. Now, I'm not an historian, I'm a political scientist by training, but I know enough about history of war to tell you the general wars of liberation do not typically include mass executions of people who are being liberated and castrating POWs with box cutters. So that's what I try to understand here. And as I delved more and more into the story, I realized that I cannot start in February 2022, and not even in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea and Russians with deep ties to the security services started the war in Donbass. So I had to go back and back in time until it turned into a historical narrative of about 200 years. Now, of course, I do talk about the war, the current war and the violence against civilians in the book, but the focus switched more from explaining what's going on now to trying to understand why and how over the last 200 years, Russian Imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet Russian authorities did all they could to control and dominate the region, which is now Ukraine, and also the violence that they occasionally used to achieve this domination when the effort to dominate Ukraine peacefully failed. But before I present my argument, let's do a short quiz. So here are 3 quotes. How many of those quotes belong to Putin? So guesses, 1, 2, 3. 3? All of them?
Yeah.
3. Actually, only 1. It's the first one, yeah, but which one will be hard to say unless you very carefully read Putin's 2021 article on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people, where he lays out his views on the issue of Ukraine. And that also was the article that got the bells ringing in various places that invasion might be coming. So the first quote is Putin. But the other two also belonged to Russian and Soviet leaders. The second quote is the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the supreme commander of Russian military during World War I, just before the Russian army invaded Galicia, a part which is now Western Ukraine, but back then belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the third quote is Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact fame, justifying the Russian invasion of Poland on September 17, 1939. So here we have it. Three very different Russian leaders, Imperial, Soviet, and contemporary Russian autocrats, using almost identical language to justify very similar policies. Why? What drives those continuities? Where do they come from and how they translate into actions on the ground? This is exactly what I'm trying to do in this book. So, in a nutshell, the argument that I'm making is that over the last 200 years, with some brief interruptions in 1920s and 1990s, controlling Ukraine and dominating Ukraine was a key goal of Russian imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet governments. And this desire to dominate Ukraine and to control Ukraine is driven by a combination of two factors: identity and security. Identity. Let's start with it because this is the most important. It's much more important than security in my view. For most Russians, being Russian implies a special relations with, and in most cases, also a sense of entitlement to Ukraine and its history, at least parts of Ukraine and its history. And this identity-based view rests on three components. The first is that contemporary Russia and Ukraine both trace their history to the same source. Kievan Rus, which was a medieval Slavic state that encompassed most of contemporary Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. In 30th century, this state was destroyed by a Mongol invasion. The lands which are now Ukraine were quickly incorporated into Poland and Lithuania, but Moscow emerged out of this period of Mongol rule as a quite powerful polity, very confident, very ambitious, and with a sense of imperial mission to dominate all lands that belong to the Kievan rules, and the sense of entitlement to this domination. Moscow explicitly presented itself as an heir, as a continuation to Kievan Rus, which is a problem if you keep in mind that Kiev is not just some mythical place, but also a capital of a different state. A second related component is the belief that Russian nation consists of three branches: Great Russians, Little Russians, which are Ukrainians, and White Russians, which are Belarusians. The terms Great Russians and Little Russians also imply hierarchical relationships, with Russians being on top and in charge, and Ukrainians being subordinate. And that's, if you ask Russians, is the natural order of things. Now, originally, those terms were purely geographic terms, denoting distance from Kiev. They did not imply hierarchical relationship, but once you start using terms like great and little, then this hierarchy will inevitably emerge. And the third idea is that all those three branches of the Russian people have only one proper language of literature, science, education, administration, and this language is Russian. Ukrainian is a regional dialect, a vernacular for uneducated peasants, and does not deserve its own literature, science, administrative use, with some exception like folklore. So Ukrainian, in fact, needs to be suppressed either to prevent the waste of resources, science and literature need to be done in Russian, or not to engage in harmful separatism. Now, most people who know something about Russia and Ukraine are well aware of those identity drivers and identity views. They're also quite common in the West, where we hear politicians and pundits referring to Ukraine as a primordial Russian lands, or Ukrainians as being basically Russians. What most people do not realize is how recent those views are. And those views are products of the 19th century, and especially a struggle between the Russian government, the Russian Empire, and the Polish independence movement. Before 17th and 18th century, most of Ukraine belonged to Poland, and this meant that most of the nobility and a large part of the urban population in Ukraine were Poles. When Russian Empire, Russia and Austria partitioned Poland out of existence, Russia received most of Poland, and with it, the Polish independence movement that sought to recreate this Polish state, which from their perspective also included Ukraine, and several very bloody, very large-scale Polish uprisings, especially one in 1830, 1831. A large part of it took place in Ukraine, and another one in program of emphasizing this unity between Ukrainian and Russian people and presenting this region as Russian. And since 1860, this campaign also turned into forced Russification of Ukraine, banning the Ukrainian language, banning Ukrainian publication, explicitly to prevent this harmful Polish influence. And that's how we get to the second part of the component, and this is security. Identity and security blend together. And security here, we're talking about two types of security. The first is pure national security. Russian leaders absolutely obsess about foreign invasions, especially invasions from the West. And you can't blame them, because Russia has been invaded from the West many times, and most of those invasions came through Ukraine. There are natural barriers, such as mountains, marshes, on the border between Ukraine and the rest of Europe, but there are none on the border between Ukraine and Russia. So once you're in Ukraine, the road to Russia is open, and Russian leaders are absolutely obsessive about this fear. And even more important than national security is the regime security aspect. Most of the many subversive ideas, revolutionary ideas, utopian ideas, democratic ideas came to Russia through Ukraine. And nothing scares a Russian autocrat more than a democratic Ukraine, because if Ukrainians manage to do it, then the presumably same Russian people will be able to do as well. Now here, it's a self-inflicted fear. It can be dealt quite easily by realizing that Russians and Ukrainians are actually different people. But that would undercut the identity basis of the regime, so it's a catch-22 situation. And that's the blend. At different points in time, the relative weight of identity and security would change, but all three factors would be present. And typically, identity considerations would be much more important than security. And my final point, which will be absolutely obvious to all the political scientists in the room, is that violence and repression is costly. So while Russian leadership does want to control and dominate Ukraine, they would rather do it peacefully, or if not peacefully, with minimal use of violence. And Russian government and Soviet governments were able to do it over the last 200 years by quite successfully using what I call a divide and repress strategy, where some groups in Ukraine that are considered particularly dangerous or despised, like the Poles or the Jews or the Ukrainian national movement, will be very heavily repressed, but the rest of the population will be protected, will be elevated, and will serve as proxies for the regime to govern Ukraine, to give it local legitimacy. And those groups that are being protected and elevated above others would vary over time. So during the Russian Empire, those would be the traditional Ukrainian Cossack elites or the Russian-speaking urban middle classes. During Soviet times, those would be the Russian-speaking proletariat, and in the cities or minorities such as Jews. The point is that at any given time, there were substantial parts of Ukrainian population that were safe, prioritized over their neighbors, and quite happy with Russian dominance. So at least were content with it. And that's, by the way, why we cannot treat the history of Ukraine or Ukraine-Russia relations just as a story of Ukrainians and Russians. Minorities play a key role in this story. And those factors, identity, security, were also present in 2022 when Russia invaded. What changed in 2022 is that the divide and repress strategy failed. Since the Euromaidan, since the revolution in 2014, and the Russian annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, what we see is, for the first time in history, an emergence of truly civic, political Ukrainian nation, where your allegiance to independence of Ukraine and the Ukrainian state is more important than which language do you speak, what's your religion, what's your identity, what's your ethnicity, or what kind of region or which region you are coming from. In part, it's a response to Russian aggression in 2014. Many people, including those who spoke Russian and were previously quite sympathetic to Russian, were genuinely offended by what Russia did. In part, it's just a natural reaction to the experience of independence. Remember, people who are now fighting for Ukraine on the front lines or lead Ukraine spent most of the, if not all of their lives living in independent Ukraine. Zelensky was just 14 when Soviet Union collapsed. And he is on the older end of this generation that leads Ukraine and fights. Those people do not think that they're Russians. They might speak Russian, they might have family in Russia, they might be ethnically Russians, but politically and civically, they consider themselves Ukrainians. Now, I do not want to overemphasize this point or to claim that the Ukrainian state is a monolith or that there are no cleavages or there are no pro-Putin or pro-Russian people in Ukraine. Of course there are, but they're in a minority. And that's what caused the invasion. Putin would not have invaded if he could dominate Ukraine through peaceful means. He tried it many times, and up until 2014, he largely succeeded. The problem for him that in 2020-22, this arrangement, this proposition was no longer appealing to the vast majority of Ukrainians. So to implement this, his identity vision of this historical unity, he had to use force. And this failure of the divide and repress strategy also explains Russian violence against civilians in Ukraine. From what we know, there definitely was a clear plan to repress and physically eliminate Ukrainian political, social, cultural elites at both national and local levels, but mass executions were not part of the plan. This violence that we see all over Ukraine came from a Russian sense of Ukrainian betrayal of what they thought Ukrainians should do. They came to Ukraine believing that they will be greeted and treated as liberators, that Ukrainians are indeed Russians, and they were genuinely very high on their own propaganda. When that happened, Ukrainian civilians stopped being liberated people and turned into traitors. And this violence was the punishment for what Russians saw as Ukrainian betrayal. Now, how does this combination of identity and security works in practice? So in the book, I focus on a number of cases: 19th and 20th century Russian Empire, the Civil War, Stalin's repression and famine, World War II, and of course, 2014 and the current war. Today, I want to briefly talk about a very telling but largely unknown episode, and largely unknown not only in the West, but also among Ukrainians themselves. And that's the Russian occupation of Galicia and Bukovina during World War I in 1914, 1915. So here is what happened. Oh, okay. So here you see it on the map, that region, that's in the white of Ukraine, that's the Austro-Hungarian part that was largely occupied. Now, after partition of Poland, Galicia went to the Habsburg Empire, and it remained the only part of the original Kiev and Rus lands that was not ruled by the Russians. There was also a very substantial Ukrainian population in Bukovina, and both regions are now parts of Western Ukraine. But unlike in the Russian Empire, where Ukrainian language and activism were repressed, in Austria, Ukrainians were equal citizens. They had political rights, they had cultural rights. And while Ukrainians were repressed in the Russian Empire, in Galicia, Austrian national movement boomed and bloomed to the extent that many Russian Ukrainians fearing persecution in Russia simply immigrated to Galicia and started working there. There was also a brisk smuggling of Ukrainian language publications across the border to Ukraine. And the most prominent example of this group is the historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who is the founding father of the Ukrainian state, the first president of independent Ukraine during the Civil War. He was a Russian subject, but he could not work in Russia, so he accepted a professorship of history at the University of Lviv in Galicia, went to work there, and wrote his seminal history of Ukraine while being in Galicia. And from the Russian perspective, this Ukrainian activism in Galicia was an absolutely mortal threat. They were mortified and horrified that if this Ukrainian movement succeeds in turning little Russians into Ukrainians in the Russian Empire, that will be literally the end of the empire and the end of the monarchy. So what did the Russian government do at that time? Well, first they started cultivating and building ties with some local pro-Russian activists in Galicia. And if you read what Austrian and Ukrainian politicians at the early 20th century wrote, it was along the lines, well, that's a danger. They finance those people, they educate them, they turn them into pro-Russian, and then they will intervene militarily under the pretext of protecting oppression Russian population. You know, when you compare it to what Russia does now, it's absolutely one-to-one. The second strategy was to beef up anti-Ukrainian propaganda. So, for instance, there was a very popular argument that the Ukrainian national identity and the very idea of Ukraine are inventions of Austrian military intelligence. Literally, there are people sitting in Vienna in the Austrian general staff creating Ukrainians to destroy Russia from within. The idea of Ukraine is a Western, in this case, Austrian and German plot, and those Ukrainian political leaders like Khrushchevsky and others are being paid and manipulated by Jews. And again, if you read the Russian propaganda right now, the parallels are striking. When World War I begins, Russian government explicitly presents the invasion of Austro-Hungarian Empire as a war of liberation, the war to liberate Austrian Russians, which are Ukrainians, regardless of whether they like it or not. So you saw the quote from Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, the Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces. Nicholas II himself talked about that there is no Galicia, there is just one great Russia from Moscow to the Carpathian Mountains, and annexing Galicia will allow Russia to reach its natural boundaries. And again, they didn't care in the slightest what the local people thought about the idea. In fact, Ukrainians in Galicia were extremely loyal to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but from the Russian perspective, they were Russians and nothing else mattered. By September 1914, Russian troops control almost all of Galicia and all of Bukovina, and they explicitly talk about the end goal of annexation. In fact, they want to annex Galicia and Bukovina, this region, immediately during the war, not even wait until the peace treaties. For various legal reasons, they decide that they will wait until the war is over, but they will treat the region as if it is already part of Russia and being subject to all the Russian laws and all the ruled in the quote-unquote Russian spirit and Russian principle, even though the international law required them not to change the legal order of the occupied territory. And it's not just the nationalists and the monarchists. In fact, the idea of annexing this region was also very popular among the constitutional Democrats, which is the main liberal party in Russia. Everyone in Russia treats this region as Russian, again, regardless of what the local thinks. Now, what ruling Galicia and Bukovina as if they're parts of Russia means in practice? Well, first, it means plunder and massive violence against civilians. And we have multiple, stories of Russian units going into battle wearing furs or even women nightgowns. And my favorite story is about how Russian troops in Chernivtsi, the capital of Bukovina, destroyed the specimen collection of the local university zoology department. They simply broke the jars in which those specimens were kept and drank all the alcohol. Yeah, I love this story. But in addition to indiscriminate violence, there is also very targeted violence against community leaders, political activists, journalists, priests, intellectuals, pretty much all of them, including the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, the head of the Greek Catholic Church, to which most Ukrainian in Galicia belong, are arrested and either kept as hostages under arrest to prevent insurrection or exiled into Russia itself. Instead, Russians start bringing people from the empire proper to rule Galicia, because if it is a Russian region, it needs to be ruled by Russians. Local pro-Russian activists say, well, what about us? We also want positions, and they immediately pushed aside. Russian authorities also changed the language of administration to Russian. They even changed the time zone to that of St. Petersburg. They started changing street signs from Latin to Cyrillic, which causes absolute mess because besides Ukrainians, no one in the region uses Cyrillic alphabet. They start changing street names, and they ban everything in Ukrainian language. All publications, all bookstores, you can't publish or sell anything in Ukrainian, not even fairy tales or calendars. In fact, you can't even send mail or telegram in Ukrainian. Government senders are instructed to destroy all Ukrainian, and by the way, also Yiddish language correspondence, but Romanian, German, French, Czech, Polish, etc., are allowed. And they target the educational system. First, they shut down all schools and universities, but then they very quickly allow German and Polish language schools to reopen. Ukrainian schools are allowed to operate only at the elementary school level. At the medium and high school level, the teachers are forced to take crash courses in Russian, about 8 weeks, and then switch to the Russian curriculum and teaching Russian language. They also start massively sending teachers from the empire paid by the City Duma of Moscow and St. Petersburg to switch the Ukrainian and only the Ukrainian educational system to Russian. All the Ukrainian language classes and history chairs in the Lviv University are shut down completely. And they also start by forced converting Ukrainian Greek Catholics into the Orthodox Church. And here, as in 2022, the Russian Orthodox Church works very closely with the government to promote their goals of Russifying and controlling Ukraine. And those policies are very different from what Russia does elsewhere. In East Prussia, that parts of it occupies in 1914, or the Caucasus, there the Russian occupation during World War II is harsh, repressive, but there are no attempts to Russify and change the identity of the region. Now, this occupation continued for only about 10 months, and it was overshadowed by everything else that happened during the Great War. But if you look at what Russia does right now in the territories it occupied, the parallels will be striking. And not just the rhetoric, not just the general gist of those policies. Sometimes the actions that the Russian current government takes are one-to-one, almost exact copy-paste of what they did in 1914, 1915, with two major differences. First, Russian occupation of Galicia during World War I also featured a huge wave of pogroms and anti-Jewish violence. We don't see it now simply because there are not enough Jews to do pogroms against, but the anti-Semitic rhetoric still exists, mostly because Zelensky happens to be Jewish. And the extent of forced conversion of Ukrainians into the Russian Orthodox Church is also smaller, but we also have quite a lot of evidence of targeting Baptist Ukrainian communities or communities that belong to the Kiev Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the current Russian government is taking out of retirement or recycling old policies. In fact, I'm absolutely sure, well, almost sure, that there is no one in the Kremlin who has any idea about what Russians did in Galicia in 1940. Rather, what I'm saying is that over more than 100 years, the goals, the ideas, the perceptions remain the same. And that's why different Russian governments use similar rhetoric and adopt similar measures to achieve similar goals. But please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the story is deterministic and that somehow Russian leaders are just bound to obsess over Ukraine. Obsession over Ukraine is not a destiny, sorry, it's a choice. And Russian leaders do not always make those choices. There were periods that they try to do things differently, especially in 1920s and 1990s, but those periods were very short and failed. So another thing that I want to do in this book is to understand what failed and how. Why, after a short period, Russians are still back to obsessing over Ukraine. And I think the most interesting period is the 1990s, when Russia and Ukraine emerged as independent states. And President Yeltsin, granted he did not think about Ukrainians as being different from Russia, but he had no desire to control Ukraine. In fact, if anything, he intuitively understood that to overcome the Soviet and imperial legacy, Russia needs to let Ukraine go. That the success of reforming Russia depends on treating Ukraine as a separate state. The problem was that he was in a minority. And the Russian government at the time, the Russian liberals, did nothing to change this. Now, we have many surveys from that period that saying that Russians in the 1990s did not think about Ukraine as an independent state or Ukrainians as a separate people, but they were just too busy making ends meet and dealing with economic hardships to have the question of Ukraine very high on the agenda. So it was an opportunity moment to define some different version of what Russia is, who Russians are, and what are the relations between Russia and Ukraine should be. Unfortunately, the liberals who were in power at that time did nothing in that regard. They believed that the only way to bring democratic, prosperous, and peaceful Russia, which they genuinely wanted to build, is to invest in economic reforms. And then there will be prosperity and everything else will follow. And here there was a stark difference between what the Russian Democrats did and what reformers did in other Central and East European post-communist states like Poland and Czech Republic, where they explicitly linked market reform to questions of identity, liberation, return to history, return to Europe, so that people would support those reforms and their vision of democracy despite the economic hardship. Russians, liberals, did none of that. And as a result, when reforms brought pain and misery, there was absolutely no reason for the average Russian to support democracy and this idea of peaceful, prosperous Russia, despite the anti-Russian opposition, the so-called red-brown alliance, very different from the reds that we're dealing here right now in this seminar, they were kept out of economic decision-making. The only thing they could do is to talk about identity, and that's what they did all the time. Now, this group was very diverse, but what united them were two things. First, they hated democracy, and second, they all obsessed over Ukraine and believed that Russia should either annex or to control Ukraine. So the largest group at the beginning of the 1990s, the largest anti-Yeltsin group, were the communists. They wanted to recreate the Soviet Union. And for that, they needed Ukraine. In fact, they explicitly talked about the recreation of Soviet Union starting with unification between Russia and Ukraine. They also controlled the parliament and issued a bunch of proclamations and decisions that invalidated the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine or invalidated the agreements that dissolved the Soviet Union. They were mostly declarations without actual power, but they alarmed everyone and they also set the tone. Conservatives, another powerful group, which became even more powerful over time. Here, the two representative figures are Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Yuri Lushkov, the powerful mayor of Moscow. Solzhenitsyn explicitly rejected the idea of Ukraine's independence in its current borders. He believed that there should be a joint state of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and possibly Kazakhstan, that's the only way to go. But if Ukrainians are crazy enough to do it on their own, they might. But with a caveat. They need to leave eastern and southern Ukraine to Russia because those are not Ukrainian lands, those are Russian lands, and Ukraine should not have them. He also talked already in the 1990s about the possibility of an open war between Russia and Ukraine. Lushkov, the very powerful mayor of Moscow, well, he got himself declared persona non grata in Ukraine by going to Crimea and saying that Crimea should go back to Russia. He also started a project that would connect mainland Russia to Crimea, the so-called Crimean Bridge. He started with Lushkov. He didn't even consult the Ukrainian government, so the project went nowhere, but that was the gist of his ideas and arguments. The radicals or the imperialist people like Eduard Limonov, the head of the National Bolshevik Party, and Alexander Dugin, the geopolitics guru. Now, we tend to dismiss those people as crackpots and fringes, and they are crackpots, no questions about that. But at the same time, Limonov and his people played a crucial role in starting the war in the Donbass in 2014. And Dugin, well, he was absolutely ridiculed for his ideas. Both he and Limonov believed that Russia should be a continental empire. He's not Putin's brain as people present him, of course, but at the same time, he has influence, especially in the security establishment. His textbook on geopolitics was funded by the Russian General Staff. He is now heading a newly created Center on Conservative Studies at Moscow University. So the result was that when liberals became irrelevant because they stake everything on economy and market reforms, that those failed, the only vision of what Russia is and who Russians are was one that included Ukraine as part of Russia, or at least as dominated by Russia. And interestingly, by the way, none of those people, with the exception of Dugin, talked about Ukraine in terms of security threat. None of them talked about a NATO threat in the 1990s. It was all identity driven. And it became dominant to the extent that even the liberals themselves started using this language. So for instance, Boris Chubais, who was one of the key architects of Russian economic reforms, started flouting the idea of Russia as a liberal empire, which of course would also include Ukraine, and some went even further. So the most interesting case is a book that everyone in the Russian political elite was reading about 2007, 2008. It's called The Third Empire, Russia as It Ought to Be. It was written by Mikhail Yuriev, who was the Vice Speaker of the Russian Parliament from a liberal party, Yabloko. And it's a futuristic novel about how Russia would be, what it would be in mid-21st century. So here you see Russia, it's in the red, it also controls all the Europe and parts of the Middle East on top of that. Russia is a party, and Iceland, yeah, and Greenland. Russia is one of 5 global empires that dominate the world. It's explicitly autocratic and theocratic. It's ruled by the Tsar. How Russia becomes this empire? Well, easy. It becomes this empire by defeating the US in a nuclear war with super weapons that Russian scholars invented. But what is even more interesting is how Russia starts being an empire. Where does it begin? And obviously it begins in Ukraine, because Ukraine, and here I quote the book, was a country that especially pissed off Russia by the very fact of its existence. And how it begins? It begins in 2008, more or less. Ukraine is deeply divided between pro-Western and pro-Ukrainian parts. There is a political crisis. There is an uprising in eastern Ukraine. Kremlin might or might not be financing it secretly, we don't know, wink, wink. But the fact is that when the government in Kiev, moves against those rebels, the rebels called Moscow for help. Russia sends the troops, threatens to use nuclear weapons if NATO intervenes, so US stays aside. And then there is a referendum, and those regions quickly join Russia, which is more or less what happened in 2014, 2022. So there are people who claim that Russian elites at that time were reading it as a to-do manual. I wouldn't go this far. We don't have the evidence, but we once again see continuities and pretty striking parallels between how the Russian intellect, goals, visions of Ukraine, and the actual actions on the ground. So I have about 2 minutes, so I will be fast. Is there a way out of this? Well, yes and no. So again, my argument hinges on the idea that Russian quest to dominate Ukraine is a mix of identity and security issues. And the current discourse that we see is very heavily on security aspects and security arrangements. On the one hand, I can understand it. Security arrangements are technical and more doable. You can put it on paper and sign this or that agreement, but I think it's deeply misguided. I think that will not bring a long-term solution or a durable peace, because it does nothing to address the identity component of Russian politics, which is much more important. So we can go over, different scenarios like Ukraine giving up the lands that is occupied by Russia and signs a peace treaty. But Putin does not want Zaporizhia Oblast. He wants Ukraine. And nothing will change that. in the peace agreement. You know, neutrality and security guarantees the same. Zelensky and other people in Ukraine are talking about, you know, Ukraine being a so-called Israel on the Dnipro, so heavily militarized state, possibly with nuclear weapons, or Ukraine joining NATO. That might prevent a conventional war. But then, if we don't address the security component, Russia will simply switch tactics and will start destabilizing Ukraine from within, trying to split it internally, bribing politicians. I mean, they're doing it in the West already. Just in Ukraine, it will be on a more massive scale, and the dangers of them doing it are much higher if Ukraine at that time is in the NATO. Some people are daydreaming about Russia collapsing and disintegrating. Well, maybe it happened. Russian Empire collapsed, Soviet Union collapsed, but Russia is not going to go to Mars. Even if Russia collapses, there will still be some portion or some part of Russia next to Ukraine that Ukraine will have to live with. And if they keep the same idea of what Russia is, very little will change. Russian democratization will probably remove the regime threat or regime security component of this equation, but, and I'm more than happy to talk about it in the Q&A, I'm skeptical. Worst case, we will get Russians electing jingoistic leaders. And then God knows what might happen. So you think you understand where I'm getting. Without changing the identity component of Russian policies, we will not achieve durable peace. Now, how can we change Russian identity? It sounds far-fetched, but I think it's doable. After all, 100 years ago, everyone in Russia perceived Galicia as a Russian land populated by Russians. Now, almost no one in Russia does. Western Ukraine is this place inhabited by crazy nationalists. We don't want them. They can go to Poland, they can go to Romania. Almost no one in Russia views Galicia and Western Ukraine as Russian lands. And since we're sitting in Palo Alto, I'm not sure there are many Mexicans who think about Palo Alto as part of Mexico anymore, and Germans have given up on Königsberg and Poles on Lviv. It does happen, but it needs to happen from the top down, by education, by cultural production. The upside is that any regime can do it. Autocracies can do it, democracies can do it, but there needs to be a political decision to start treating Ukraine differently and to decoupling Russia from Ukraine. What should Ukraine do? The only way for Ukraine to survive is to continue being democratic, pluralistic, and inclusive, to deny Russia this divide and repress strategy. Because the moment there will be people in Ukraine who would prefer Russian rule to being in Ukraine, there will be people in Russia who will immediately jump on this opportunity. So investing in Ukrainian culture, language, identity, but not becoming repressive. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That's really interesting, and I'm looking forward to the book coming out. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Since Anna and I share this seminar, I thought that that I would ask the first question, and since she got to do the introduction, and then take your question. So just indicate by putting your hand up. I'll keep a list. And when you ask your question, I see you, Norman Neymar. I see you, Kathryn. Just let us know who you are. So since the microphone happens to have landed in my hand, maybe I will ask the first question. So this is interesting. It does. Some of it comes as a bit of a surprise, though, as I think through the timeline. I have lots of different questions. It isn't clear that yes, right, all Russians would have been agreeable before 2022 to taking all of Ukraine. Yet that seemed to be the goal of the elites, right? So why is that? Why was that the goal? I think probably a vast majority would be fine with taking Crimea. But not going as far as they went. So that seems a disconnect between the elite perception and public perception. So can you explain that? And then your solution is education, and shifting Russian identity so that it doesn't include Ukraine and presumably Belarus, and Putin has murmured recently about Poland as well. But they are moving in the absolute opposite direction with their new education policy and textbooks and important subjects class in post-secondary school. So it seems like, you said the next leaders are likely to be jingoistic. You'd have to have major reformers who would go in an opposite direction. And as a student of Russia currently who can't go there, as many of us cannot, I don't see that happening, especially given the strength of the propaganda. So maybe you can comment on both of those, and I'll start my list. Apologies.
Thank you. So about the goals. So you're right. Not that there are different goals and goals. I mean, for both the elites and the population, the perception is that Russia and Ukraine are very similar historically. It's pretty clear that the order to invade came from Putin for his own identity and legacy reasons. But the point is that the rest of the population went with it because it resonated with the existing myths and ideas. So Putin and his obsession might explain the timing of the invasion, but not everything else. And the rest of the Russian population would rather have it peacefully rather than violently. But there are no questions about what is being done and why it's being done. If anything, the perception that Ukraine is rational, and as you mentioned, is only being reinforced by the propaganda, and it seems to resonate by many things. I mean, we can't be skeptical about pointing in Russia, but we have other sources. So, for instance, there is a wonderful project in Ukraine that collects graffiti left by Russian soldiers in Ukraine, and they were kind enough to share all their data set with me. And here you see quite a lot of the same language, the same slogans, the same ideas, even when nobody forces those Russian soldiers to leave those graffitis. So Putin might explain the timing and the decision itself, but it did resonate with the rest of the population. In terms of the education going in absolutely opposite direction, yes, and it's frustrating. And I absolutely agree with you that, for the time being, things will likely get worse before they get better. But I think that's the only way to do it. When it will happen, I have no idea. Maybe never. But if they get serious about this, then that's how we do it. Now, I'm speculating here, but I wouldn't be surprised that the idea of questioning whether Ukraine is Russia and whether Russia is Ukraine might have already started among some people who went to Ukrainian soldiers and got killed and injured, and their family. They don't like Ukrainians, to put it mildly. And the same process also happened with Galicia. The change came after so many Russians went to fight against the Ukrainian nationalists. And I'm not a fan of Ukrainian nationalists in Western Galicia, in fact. I think they're horrible people who did horrible things. But by fighting for so long, they convinced many people in Russia that they are, in fact, different. So there might be already some bottom-up foundation. But to make it permanent and to make it common across the board, it needs to come from the top. I agree with you. I don't see it happening anytime soon.
Okay, Norman Neymark.
Thank you, Eugene. That was great. I look forward to the book. So I don't think anybody will question, your historical overview. I mean, I think it's very interesting, very well. It's case study of being Galicia is very interesting, and useful. It's really a matter of emphasis that I keep thinking about and listening. And there are 2 points I'd just like you to comment on. One has to do with this identity and security, kind of dichotomy. If I think about security, I also think about political systems like Ukraine being democratic, and about the Western orientation of Ukraine these days. So if you think about that in the security category, I wonder if the security category doesn't really overcome the issue of identity. I mean, to me, the real issue is the question of security. and not so much. The question of identity is there. It was unquestionably, as you described it, brought up. But I just wonder about that. The second area of emphasis has to do with how important the period since, let's say, Maidan, the 2014 has been to the development of Ukrainian national identity. I mean, again, from my perspective, the war has less destroyed Ukraine, and the intent to destroy in some ways has reverberated in the creation of a new Ukraine, and you indicated that yourself, that's much more dangerous to Russia than it ever was before. And so when you take this, kind of longue durée of history, I go back and I think about, I think about I don't do this all the time, but you make me think about the 1870s or the 1890s or earlier periods of Soviet history when, the kinds of issues you're talking about were not so bad. How do you think about this waiting, which again, the period since 2014 and the period, a long period, 150 or 200 years before, when there were dicey times. You just showed one, but they weren't always that dicey.
So should we collect or
Yes.
should I
You
go?
go for that. I'll just
Okay.
go through my list, which is
Okay.
Sierra, Kathryn, Voila, and Aisha.
Thank you. So identity and security, it's always a mix, right? They're always present. I would disagree with you that security is more important, because when you look at what people are talking about in the government, what they care about, what they write about, security would be there, and there were periods in which security was more prominent. So for instance, during 1930s, the fear of Polish invasion was more important than it interacted with, but was more important in starting thinking that his hatred of Ukrainians. But most of the time, the key driver is identity mixed with security, because a lot of those identity questions arise from the threat of security. Poles turning those Russians into Poles, into Catholics, or the West turning those Russians into something else, which they shouldn't be. So I don't have a good way to clearly disentangle in the identity and security. If I could, I would have done it. So the caveat is that it's always a mix. All three are always there. I think that identity overall is much more important by looking at what people say and the actual policies. The actual Russian policies target identity. They rarely build fortification or send more troops or invest in purely security-oriented policies. Focusing on identity is always what they start with. In terms of the long durée, yes, you're right, there are periods in which this identity issue is less prominent, but less prominent because in the previous period, the government succeeded in cracking down on the Ukrainian national movement and Russifying it. So the late period that you mentioned, late Soviet Union, it's not really an issue because Ukraine is absolutely Russified. And the KGB is controlling everyone. But once you see a single Ukrainian nationalist or a dissident speaking up, he will be cracked down on to the extent that no one in Russia proper would be cracked down. Ukrainian dissidents received much harsher sentences than almost everyone else in the Soviet Union besides the Zionists. So you see what they try to do. Or if you try to appear on the Ukrainian TV wearing vyshyvanka, which is the embroidered shirt, that's a problem. But the rest, yeah, they're quiet because they succeeded, because the repression succeeded previously.
Yeah, I'll add David to the list. That was Norman Neymark, who's a professor emeritus of history. Wow. Okay, Sierra.
Great. I'm Sierra. I'm a PhD candidate in Russian and East European history here at Stanford. I find this parallel with Galicia incredibly interesting, very much buy into all of this, but I think that there has been an important rhetorical shift in the way that Putin talks about Ukraine as an invention. That is, it's not an invention of Jews or an invention of the West, but it's actually an invention of perhaps Soviet policy, of if not Russia, then at least of the Soviet Union. Do you sort of speak to this shift in your book, and how do you sort of situate that?
Right. So you're right. Putin cannot talk about Ukraine being an invention of the Austrian general staff because there was no, rather than the Soviet Union, because there was no Soviet Union in 1914. So what remained is the idea that Ukraine is an artificial entity created by someone else rather than people on the ground. It's just that for the Russian authorities, it was the Austrian general staff and the Jews and Germany, but it's still invented with the same idea of trying to weaken Russian nationalism. Because the gist of the Putin's rhetoric that Ukraine was invented by the Bolsheviks, it was invented by the Bolsheviks to destroy the Tsar, to destroy the Russians. The old Russian imperial perception of themselves. So who is to blame? Changed, but the general idea I think remains the same over time. And by the way, during the Soviet times in 1930s, they talked about Ukrainian national movement being funded and created by Poland, which, if you know anything about Polish history, would absolutely blow your mind. And the Polish nationalists, so UPA and the Ukraine and the Polish military organization in Ukraine actually cooperating to target the Soviet Union. Yes, you need to read it to believe it, but it is there.
All right, Kathryn.
So Kathryn partner. I want to take you back to one of your very first statements, which is when you were talking about how you started this project, looking at the incredible brutal violence being committed against civilians. And I just wanted to ask if that might also, not that it nullifies anything that you say about the identity and security issues and attitudes towards Ukraine and Ukrainians, but how do you figure in what Russian army did in Chechnya?
Mm-hmm.
What Russians, well, World War II as well, what Russian soldiers do to their fellow soldiers in terms of like incredible brutality and viciousness, and
Mm-hmm.
might that be something separate, or what's your thinking?
Thank you.
May I two finger on that? A lot of the soldiers currently who perpetrated some of these things were Buryats, right? Or Tibets. So, that's a big question.
Absolutely, or Chechens, or many others, right? So I think when it comes to violence against civilians, we see two patterns of violence, different patterns of violence. One is indiscriminate violence from a distance, that's Mariupol, where you just shell cities, as Russia did in Grozny, as Russia did in Syria. That's just how Russia fights. The kind of violence that would fit my argument better is places like Bucha, where you have face-to-face contacts between the Russian military and the Ukrainian civilians that they're targeting. And here we have multiple stories from survival and witnesses about who was targeted. A lot of this was drunk soldiers who just want to plunder, who have a sense of impunity, but quite a lot of that was also rather targeted. So people who speak Ukrainian, or people who come from Western Ukraine, or people who perceived as being supportive of the state, of veterans, or people who are active in the civic society. Mariupol is absolutely indiscriminate. Bucha, there is a lot of indiscriminate violence fueled by alcohol and impunity, but there are also very clear patterns within this violence as well. And this violence targets those who perceived as Ukrainians and those who perceived as ungrateful for liberation, or we expect you to love Russia, but you do not. That's what gets people killed.
Okay, Voila.
Eugene, I absolutely buy your argument, but I think about how identity changes over time. Right? And so we might think about the starting point, like but then there were a lot of periods in between. My question is about how Russia's repressive efforts and wars in Ukraine or elsewhere affected its identity conception, and as Russia learning something from this experience that's Ukraine or elsewhere, over what methods work, what methods can backfire, learning something about itself in the process, and what isn't, and
Thanks for that. Yeah. Okay, so so I think Russians do learn quite a lot tactically. I mean, we can say quite a lot about them being drunk and being very violent, but they're not stupid people. They do learn, but the lessons are mostly tactical lessons about what worked best, and then they tend to be forgotten when the next regime comes in. Because quite a lot of the mess that we see right now could have been avoided had Russians actually learned the lessons of history. They do not. They have a very specific idea of what Russian history is, and it dictated from above, and it destroys a lot of the tactical learning from below. So I don't really know what Russians will learn from this war. They will probably learn quite a lot, but my sense that eventually it will be forgotten, and unless we change it, the basic identity conceptions, we will be back talking about the same things and Russian leaders writing the same inane articles about the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian people. I hope not to be around to witness that, though. Do we have anything online, by the way?
We don't do that.
Oh,
No,
okay.
we don't let
Okay.
Zoom rule the room.
Okay,
That's our motto.
that's great.
Yep. Zoom doesn't rule the room. Aisha does right now, though. Go ahead.
Thank you for your talk, and I appreciate this identity, drawing that line. My question is about identity or security framework that we're proposing, and I think there is a way to think about them together, right? I mean, there are all these narrative identity or narratives of identity that we mentioned, but at some point they become much more prominent and much more useful, right? And I'm thinking about this in relation to regime security, not the security of the nation, but the regime security. And going back to Professor Merriman's question about Maidan and this posing a big threat to Putin, maybe this was, the narrative, this identity became much more useful. So what would you?
Right. So thank you. Yeah, and I mean you're absolutely right. And that was the struggle that I was having while writing the book between me as a trained card-carrying political scientist and me as a wannabe historian, because the political scientist in me was all the time, well, is it identity or is it security? You need to decide, what, and you need to separate, and you need to define what is what, and then the wannabe amateur historian in me would, wake up and say, well, actually, it's complicated. It's all of it. It's a mix. All of it is present, but honestly, I can't, pinpoint and say that that's 60% security, 40% identity, or vice versa. It's a blend, and I cannot separate it, at least not now. What I can say is that all three are present, and I know that. For an academic book, that probably would not be a satisfying answer, but that's how this progresses. And at different points in time, Russian leaders emphasize different things, but all three are always there, and all three are geared towards the same goal of controlling and dominating the play.
Okay, David Leighton.
Let me proudly identify myself as a brand advisor of Eugene. As his advisor was my advisee.
Grandfather. Yeah.
So I agree with Norman that you told a compelling narrative, but there is a compelling counter narrative that I'd like to ask you to say, what did they get wrong? I'm thinking of Terry Martin's affirmative action empire, maybe followed by Ron Sundi's Revenge of the Past. And they argue that security for the Bolshevik state was enhanced by actually affirmative action policies, which promoted the languages and the cultures, especially of the 14 titular Republican populations. And So the affirmative action empire idea was that Ukrainians and Kazakh and Tatar were all inventions and were developed in the National Academies of Sciences for purposes of control. And so my question to you is, what did they get wrong?
I think Terry and Ron got everything right. It just that, and that goes to my point that obsession with Ukraine, trying to dominate Ukraine, is a choice, not a destiny. The thing is that leaders change, and those periods were short-lived because different leaders came in. In the case of the affirmative action empire, it was a shift to Stalin and him becoming great Russian nationalist, and him treating Ukraine as a threat that forced the rolling back of the colonization. So you're right, it's not deterministic. Had the indemnization policy with all the problems that it created and all the resistance that was to it on the ground, it was very unpopular in Ukrainian cities and among the middle classes and the communists in Ukraine, because suddenly they had to compete with Ukrainians and suddenly they had to learn the Ukrainian language. But if Lenin lived longer, we might have had a very different story. It's just that we had a change of government and new old ideas came in. And I think, and Terry is also talking about that in the affirmative action empire. It just different leaders after this brief period of not obsessing with Ukraine, the other leaders come in and the old ideas are back. Because the general perception of Ukraine does not change. Right? Within Russia, despite this Indonesian campaign, Russians in Russia did not stop believing that Ukrainians are Russian. Those ideas were suppressed by the government. And if you look at what was the most popular Russian book and the Russian play, it was Bulgakov's The White Guard and Niturbin in 1920s and 1930s, which is rapidly anti-Ukrainian. That's what Russians wanted to hear. The government thought different. But then Stalin, with his ideas came in, and those ideas aligned with the ideas of the population, and that's how this policy got rolled back. But there were windows of opportunity, and that's why I also optimistic that it can be changed with different leaders. Just mistakes that are made.
So we have a few minutes left, and see if anybody else has a question. But if not, I've got another one. Okay, these are very interesting answers that you're giving, but I want to probe some of this a little bit more. So I've been recently reading several books on the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there are lots of good ones out, and there are different accounts of 1991 and specifically the relationships between the negotiation basically that sets up the Commonwealth of Independent States and the end of the Soviet Union. So there is a bit of a debate. I was surprised in the Zubok book. He says that there was this discussion between Yeltsin and Kravchuk about giving Crimea, quote unquote, back to Russia, and also everything south and east of the Dnieper is Ukraine. And so apparently he brings this up with Kravchuk, and Kravchuk says, no, we just had this referendum and we're not going to do that. And Yeltsin then drops it, apparently. So I guess I want to probe you a little bit more on timing of why, there was a moment when Ukraine is also weak. It is not leaning Western, toward democracy any more than Russia is in 91, 92, perhaps less so. And so as weak as Russia was at the time, I mean, they really could have pressed that point, yet they don't. So there's variation there. And as you said, leaders change. You just answered that. The other variation is so I guess you keep saying it's not deterministic, it's a choice, but some of what you're saying sounds a little deterministic. So would any Russian leader in Putin's place have done this with Ukraine? Yeltsin didn't do it, and people clearly disagree. And then I want to ask about Georgia, which no one's asked you about yet.
done this, you mean invading Ukraine in 2022? I think so.
Or in the post-Soviet period.
Right. So I think that most Russian leaders would not have invaded Ukraine in 2014 or 2022. So going back to 1990, 91, 1992, you're right. It could have went very, very differently. But Yeltsin was determined not to do it. And also for this book, I interviewed Andrei Kozyrev, who was the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was also very explicit about the reason. So first, we want a peaceful Ukraine. We don't want to open this can of war. We want Russia to be a normal, peaceful state. Now, having said that, they also had an idea that Ukraine is actually an invention, and if they wait long enough, then Ukraine itself might come to Russia. There was a wonderful article in Financial Times from 1993 that talks about senior Russian diplomats, probably not Kozyrev. I should have asked him about this. I didn't. But senior Russian diplomats advising Western colleagues not to build embassies in Kiev because they will be redundant in a couple of years. Ukraine will simply go back to Russia. So it wasn't high on the agenda. They were too preoccupied with economical issues, and there were people in the Russian government who were committed, like Kozyrev or Yeltsin, who were committed to a peaceful Russia as is in all borders. They could have done things better. They failed in projecting this idea of changing the Russian identity. But yes, that was one of the brief moments. Another one is, of course, 1920s, where there was an opportunity to change Russian identity. In terms of Putin, yeah, I don't think that democratic Russia would have invaded. I think that a leader who is less high on his own historical supply, and not as isolated from the world as Putin was during COVID, would not have done it. And COVID isolation and his age and everything else certainly did play a role in his thinking. We also know who he spent his COVID isolation. Essentially, the only person who was allowed next to him was Yuri Kovalchuk. Now, who is Kovalchuk, or more precisely, who is Kovalchuk's father? Right, a naval historian who spent his entire career writing about great Soviet defense of Crimea. So we know where those ideas are coming from. Yes, yes, and then I think Ukrainian. So I don't think that a leader. I don't think that under different conditions and Putin less isolated, we probably would not have had a story unfolding as it is. And yes, different leaders do make different choices, although, of course, for a compelling story, a deterministic argument sounds better and sells more. Yeah. I'm not going to deny that.
But he did develop an identity for Russia that was not, but you're suggesting it's kind of predetermined. He grabbed an off-the-shelf identity for Russia because I do remember being at Valdai, I can't remember, maybe 10 or 11 years ago, and the topic was, what is Russia's national identity? And actually none of this stuff was part of it. Denise is nodding over there. None of this.
Yeah, but below, I mean, it wasn't even questioned that, Eastern Ukraine and Crimea are Russians.
Didn't even come up. Yeah. It was more, it was more modernizing talk as opposed to anything like this.
Yeah, by the way, Yeltsin also had a committee on developing a Russian idea and came up with nothing.
Right. All right, if there are no other questions, we're at 1:15. And so, Eugene, thank you so much.
Thank you.